All right, I think we're live. I can't make it on time. So let's see how it goes in here this morning. If we got any improvement. Ooh, it's the death match has started. And it's not free for all. You know I want the free for all, but they're not giving it. Oh my god, and the dang audio is going out into the room. Good thing I caught that. Alright, so yeah. You know, I don't know, people get after me, because I buy all these blueprints. And I'm like, what I'm going to do with all these, you know, credits? It's like, down the road, if I want to upgrade anything, I'm going to need the blueprints. And you see I'm almost at 2 million credits. And this is steady buying. I mean, steady buying. Every day, the blueprints that come up. And I used to not buy them, but man, now that I've got that situation with the medic, you know, look at this. I want to upgrade him. I need 1,050 to go up one level, and I'm like, man, if I had been buying those blueprints every single time, I might be in a better situation right now. But right now, I've got to get at least 875 of MD blueprints to move up one level. Right. So if it's not, and it's not hurting me, see, I got almost 2 million credits, and that's just buying those little thousands things. Yeah, looks like we're going. Okay, so what is the disruptor? So be looking out for those. They got jacked up. And I don't know, I might be able to use credits to buy some of this stuff, and it might be benefit, but somebody's going to need to come on my stream and tell me, because you know, it's like I could see how to go to the shop before they put all that other crap in there where I got to study it. And I'm like, man, you got to somehow convince me that I need to be studying that. I mean, doesn't it come down to my personal skill and the quality of the equipment that I'm using? All right, here we go. Picking up where we left off.
Christ. 206. The arrival of these warriors. with the account of their victories, revived the courage of the Crusaders who had remained in Palestine under the command of Leopold, Duke of Austria. With such a powerful reinforcement, nothing was talked of but renewing the war against the Mussulmans. The project of conquering the banks of the Nile often occupied the thoughts of the Christians. Since the idea of a war in Egypt had been put forth by the Pope himself amidst the Council of the Lateran, it had been considered as an inspiration from heaven. They only thought of the advantages of a rich conquest, and the perils of so difficult an enterprise appeared of no importance in the eyes of the soldiers of the cross. The Christian army, commanded by the King of Jerusalem, the Duke of Austria, and William, Count of Holland, embarked at the port of Ptolemais and landed within sight of Damietta, on the northern bank of the second mouth of the Nile. The city of Damietta, 207, situated at the distance 232 of a mile from the sea, had a double rampart on the riverside and a triple wall on the land side. A tower arose in the middle of the Nile, and an iron chain, which reached from the city to the tower, prevented the passage of vessels. The city contained a numerous garrison, with provisions and munitions of war for a long siege. Damietta had already several times resisted formidable attacks of the Christians. Roger, King of Sicily, had made himself master of it in the preceding century, but he was not able to retain and defend it against the united forces of the Mussulmans. The Crusaders arrived before Damietta early in April. Having pitched their tents in a vast plain, they had behind them lakes and pools abounding in fish of all kinds. 208, before them the Nile, covered with their vessels. 1,000 canals, crowned with evergreen papyrus and reeds, intersected the lands and spread freshness and fertility around them. In the fields which had so lately been the theater of sanguinary contests, no traces of war were to be seen. Harvests of rice covered the plains in which Christian armies had perished by famine. Groves of oranges and citron glowed with flowers and fruit. Woods of palms and sycamores, thickets of jasmines and odoriferous shrubs, with a crowd of plants and wonders, unknown to the pilgrims, created the image of an earthly paradise, and made them fancy that Damietta must have been the first dwelling of man in his state of innocence. The aspect of a beautiful sky and a rich climate intoxicated them with joy, kept hope alive in their hearts, and held out to them the accomplishment of all the divine promises. In their religious and warlike enthusiasm, they believed they saw Providence prodigal of its miracles for the success of their arms. Scarcely had they established their camp on the bank of the Nile, when an eclipse of the moon covered the horizon with darkness. And even this phenomenon inflamed their courage, as it appeared to them a presage of the greatest victories. 233. The first attacks, 209, were directed against the tower built in the middle of the Nile. Vessels, in which were placed towers, ladders, and drawbridges, approached the walls. The soldiers who manned them, braving the arrows and murderous machines of the Mussulmans, made several assaults. But prodigies of strength, courage, and skill were useless. The most intrepid of the Crusaders, victims of their own rash bravery and devotedness, perished, swallowed up by the waves, without being able to be succored or avenged by their companions. In all the attacks, nothing could equal the impetuous valor of the Western warriors. But this valor was not seconded by either the prudence of the commanders or the discipline of the soldiers. Each nation had its leader, its machines of war, its days for fighting. No order governed either attack or retreat. The soldiers on board the vessels wished to maneuver them, the sailors would fight. The frequent checks they experienced, at length, however, taught them prudence. The lightest of their vessels ascended the Nile, and returning to cast anchor above the tower built in the middle of the river, attacked and broke asunder the bridge of boats which united the tower with the city. Industry likewise lent its assistance to the bravery of the Crusaders. Machines of war were invented, of which no models had previously existed. An enormous wooden castle, built upon two vessels, 210, joined together by beams and joists, was admired as a miraculous invention, and considered as a certain pledge of victory. Upon this floating castle was a drawbridge, which could be lowered upon the tower of the Saracens, and galleries destined to receive the soldiers who were to attack the walls. a poor priest of the Church of Cologne, 211, who had preached the crusade on the banks of the 234 Rhine, and followed the Christian army into Egypt, was charged with the superintendence of the erection of this formidable edifice. As the popes in their letters always advised the crusaders to take with them to the East men skilled in the mechanical arts, 212, the Christian army was in no want of workmen to perform the most difficult labors. The liberality of the leaders and soldiers supplied all the necessary expenses. The whole army looked with impatience for the moment at which the enormous fortress should be brought near to the tower on the Nile. Prayers were offered up in the camp for the protection of heaven. The Patriarch and the King of Jerusalem, the clergy and the soldiers, during several days, submitted to all the austerities of penitence, all marched in procession barefooted to the seashore. The leaders had fixed upon the festival of the Apostle St. Bartholomew as the day for the assault, and the crusaders were filled with hope and ardor. They vied with each other in eagerness to be the assaulting party, for which the best soldiers of each nation were selected, and Leopold, Duke of Austria, the model of Christian knights, obtained the honor of commanding an expedition with which the first success of the crusade was connected. On the appointed day, the two vessels surmounted by the wooden tower received the signal for moving. They carried 300 warriors fully armed, and an innumerable multitude of Mussulmans assembled on the walls contemplated the spectacle with surprise mingled with dread. The two vessels pursued their silent course up the middle of the river, whilst all the crusaders either drawn up in battle array on the left bank of the Nile, or dispersed over the neighboring hills, saluted with loudest acclamations the moving fortress which bore the fortunes and the hopes of the Christian army. On drawing near to the walls, the two vessels cast anchor, and the soldiers prepared for the assault. Whilst the Christians hurled their javelins and got ready 235, their lances and swords, the Saracens poured upon them torrents of Greek fire, and employed every effort to make the wooden castle on which their enemies fought a prey to the flames. The one party was encouraged by the shouts and applauses of the Christian army, the other by the 1,000 times repeated acclamations of the inhabitants of Damietta. Amidst the fight, the machine of the crusaders all at once appeared on fire. The drawbridge lowered onto the walls of the tower wavered and was unsteady. The flagstaff of the Duke of Austria fell into the Nile, and the banner of the Christians remained in the hands of the Mussulmans. At this sight the Saracens uttered the most extravagant cries of joy, whilst groans and sounds of grief were heard along the shore on which the crusaders were encamped. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, the clergy, the whole army, fell on their knees, and raised their supplicating hands towards heaven. But soon, as if God had been favorable to their prayers, the flames were extinguished, the machine was repaired, the drawbridge was replaced, and the companions of Leopold renewed the attack with more ardor than ever. From the top of their fortress they commanded the walls of the tower, and dealt mighty blows with saber, spear, battle-axe, and iron mace. Two soldiers sprang upon the platform upon which the Saracens defended themselves. They carried terror among the besieged, who descended tumultuously to the first stage of the tower. The latter set fire to the floor, and endeavored to oppose a rampart of flames between themselves and the enemies who rushed down in pursuit of them. But these last efforts of despair and bravery presented but a vain resistance to the Christian soldiers. The Mussulmans were attacked in all parts of the tower, and their walls, shaken by the machines, appeared to be sinking around them, and about to bury them beneath the ruins. In this hopeless condition they laid down their arms, and sued to their conquerors for life. After this memorable victory, the Christians, masters of the Tower of the Nile, broke the chain which impeded the passage of vessels, and their fleet was able to approach close to the ramparts of the city. About the same time, September 1217, Malik Adel, who 236 had rendered himself so formidable to the Christians, died in the capital of Egypt. He heard before his death of the victory which the Christians had gained at Damietta, and the Crusaders did not fail to say that he had sunk under the effects of despair, and that he carried with him to the tomb the power and glory of the Mussulmans. The Christians, in their histories, have represented Malik Adel as an ambitious, cruel, and stern prince. Oriental writers celebrate his piety and mildness. An Arabian historian boasts of his love of justice and truth, 213, and pays, by a single trait, the moderation of the absolute monarchs of Asia, when he says that the brother of Saladin listened without anger to that which displeased him. Historians unite in praising the bravery of the Mussulman prince, and the ability he displayed in the execution of all his designs. No prince knew better how to make himself obeyed, or to give to supreme power that brilliant exterior which strikes the imagination of nations, and disposes them to submission. In his court, he always appeared surrounded with the pomp of the East. His palace was as a sanctuary which no one durst approach. He rarely appeared in public. When he did, it was in a manner to inspire fear, as he was fortunate in all his undertakings. The Mussulmans had no difficulty in believing that the favorite of fortune was the favorite of heaven. The Caliph of Baghdad sent ambassadors to salute him King of Kings. Malik Adel was pleased to be styled in Kamsif Eden 214. This sort of religion, and this glorious name, which he had merited by his contests with the Christians, drew upon him the love and confidence of the soldiers of Islamism. He astonished the East by his abdication, as much as he had astonished it by his victories. The surprise he excited only added to his glory as well as to his power. And, that his destiny might in everything be extraordinary, Fortune decreed that when he had descended 237 from the throne, he should still remain master. His 15 sons, of whom several were sovereigns, still trembled before him. Nations prostrated themselves on his passage. Up to the very hour in which he closed his eyes, his presence, his name only, maintained peace in his family in the provinces, and order and discipline in the armies. At his death the face of everything began to change. The empire of the Ayyubites, which he had sustained by his exploits, gave tokens of decline. The ambition of the emirs, for a long time restrained, broke out into conspiracies against the supreme authority. A spirit of license began to be apparent in the Muslim armies, and particularly among the troops that defended Egypt. The Crusaders ought to have profited by the death of Malik Adel, and the consequences it was sure to produce, by attacking the discouraged Muslims without intermission. But instead of following up their success, after they had obtained possession of the Tower of the Nile, they all at once neglected the labors of the siege, and appeared to have fallen asleep over their first victories. A great number of them, persuaded that they had done enough for the cause of Christ, only thought of embarking to return into Europe. Every vessel that left the port recalled to the pilgrims remembrances of home. And the beautiful sky of Damietta, which had inflamed their imaginations at the commencement of the siege, was not sufficient to retain them in a country which they began to consider as a place of exile. The clergy, however, warmly censured the retreat and desertion of the Crusaders, and implored heaven to punish the base soldiers who thus abandoned the standards of the cross. 6,000 pilgrims from Brittany, who were returning to Europe, were shipwrecked on the coast of Italy, and almost all perished. And the ecclesiastics, with the most ardent of the Crusaders, did not fail to see, in so great a disaster, a manifestation of divine anger. When the Crusaders of Friesland, after having deserted the banners of the Holy Land, had returned into the west, the ocean all at once broke through the dikes, and overflowed its customary boundaries. The richest provinces of Holland were submerged, and 100,000 inhabitants, with whole cities, disappeared beneath the waters. Many Christians attributed 238 this calamity to the culpable retreat of the Frisian and Dutch Crusaders. The Pope beheld with pain the return of the pilgrim deserters from the cause of Christ. Honorius neglected nothing to secure the success of a war he had preached. And he every day, both by prayers and threats, pressed the departure of those who, after having taken the cross, delayed the accomplishment of their vow. According to the usual custom of navigators, 2 periods of the year were fixed upon at which it was best to cross the sea. The pilgrims almost always embark in the month of March and in the month of September, whether to repair to the east or to return to Europe, which caused them to be compared to those birds of passage that change their climate at the approach of a new season, and towards the end of fine weather. 215. At each passage, the Mediterranean was covered with vessels which transported crusaders, some returning to their homes, others going to fight the infidels. At the very moment the Christians were deploring the loss of the Frisian and Dutch warriors, their spirits were restored by seeing crusaders from Germany, Pisa, Genoa, Venice, and several provinces of France arrive in the camp at Damietta. Among the French warriors, history names her Count of Nevers, Hugh, County La Marche, Miles de Bar-sur-Seine, the Lords John of Artois and Ponce de Crancy, Écuyer de Facy, and Savory de Moulins. They were accompanied by the Archbishop of Bordeaux, the bishops of Angers, Autun, Beauvais, Paris, Meaux, Noyon, and C. England also sent the bravest of her knights into Egypt. Henry III had taken the cross after the Council of the Lateran, but if he could not quit his dominions, at that time a prey to civil wars and torn by discord, the Earls of Harcourt, Chester, and Arundel, with Prince Oliver, 216, were honored with the charge of acquitting, in his name, the vow he had taken to fight in the East for the cause of Christ. At the head of the pilgrims who arrived at that time in Egypt were 2 cardinals, whom the Pope had sent to the 239th Christian army. Robert de Courten, one of the preachers of the crusade, was charged with the mission of inculcating the moral precepts of Christ in the camp of the Crusaders, and animating the zeal and devotion of the soldiers by his eloquence. Cardinal Pelagius, Bishop of Albano, was invested with the entire confidence of the Holy See. He brought with him the treasures that were to defray the expenses of the war. The Crusaders from Rome and several other cities of Italy marched under his orders, and recognized him as their military leader. Cardinal Pelagius, by his position, was endowed with great authority in the Christian army, and his naturally imperious character led him to assume even more power than he had received from the Holy See. In whatever affair he was employed, he acknowledged no equal, and would not endure a superior. He had been known to oppose the sovereign pontiff in the bosom of the conclave. He would have resisted the most powerful monarchs, even in their own councils. Cardinal Pelagius, persuaded that Providence meant to make use of him to accomplish great designs, believed himself fit for all works, and appointed to all kinds of glory. When he had formed a determination, he maintained it with invincible obstinacy, and was influenced by neither obstacles nor perils, nor even by the lessons of experience. If Pelagius originated any advice in council, he supported it with all the menaces of the court of Rome, and often gave cause for a belief that the thunders of the church had only been confided to his hands, that he might secure the triumph of his own opinions. Pelagius had scarcely arrived in Egypt, when, as legate of the Pope, he disputed the command of the army with John of Brienne. To support his pretensions, he asserted that the Crusaders had taken up arms at the desire of the sovereign pontiff, that they were the soldiers of the Church, and ought to recognize no other head than the legate of the Holy See. These assumptions gave great offense to the barons and principal leaders. From that time it was easy to foresee that discord would be introduced by him whose mission it was to establish peace, and that the envoy of the Pope, charged to preach humility among Christians, was 240, about to ruin everything by his mad presumption. 217, Cardinal de Courten died shortly after his arrival. The continuator of William the Tyrant lost deploring the death of this legate, who had been remarkable for his moderation, characterizes, by a single word, the conduct of Pelagius, and the consequences that might be expected from it, by saying, "Then died Cardinal Peter, and Pelagius lived," which was a great pity. In the meantime, the approach of danger had reunited the Muslim princes. The Caliph of Baghdad, whom James of Victory 218 styled the Pope of the Infidels, exhorted the nations to take up arms against the Christians. All the sons of Malik Adel, who reigned over the provinces of Syria and of Yemen, prepared to march to the assistance of Egypt. The Sultan of Damascus, after having made several incursions into the territories of Ptolemy, gathered together his whole army, and resolved to go and defend Damietta. As he had reason to fear the Christians might take advantage of his absence to seize Jerusalem and fortify themselves in it, he caused the ramparts of the Holy City to be demolished. He also ordered the fortress of Tabor, and all those that the Muslims held along the coasts of Palestine, to be destroyed. A vigorous measure that afflicted the infidels, but was calculated to afflict the Christians still more, as it proved to them that they had to contend with enemies animated by 241, despair, and disposed to sacrifice everything to secure their own safety. the Sultan of Cairo encamped in the vicinity of Damietta, where he awaited the princess of his family. The garrison of the city received everyday provisions and reinforcements, and was in a condition to resist the Christian army for a length of time. The preparations and the approach of the Muslims at length roused the Crusaders from their state of inaction. Animated by their leaders, but more by the appearance of danger and the presence of a formidable enemy, still led by the King of Jerusalem, who had resisted the pretensions of Pelagius, the Christian soldiers resumed the labors of the siege and made several assaults upon the city on the riverside. The winter, which had just set in, did not at all prevent their attacks. Nothing could equal the heroic constancy with which they braved, during several months, cold, rain, hunger, all the fatigues of war, and all the rigors of the season. A contagious malady committed great ravages in the Christian army. A frightful storm, which lasted 3 days, carried away the tents and the baggage of both leaders and soldiers. But nothing diminished the fury of the contests, which were incessantly renewed. At length the Christians, having become masters of all the western bank of the Nile, determined to cross the river and attack the city on the land side. The passage was difficult and dangerous. The Sultan of Cairo had fixed his camp on the opposite shore. The plain on which the Crusaders wished to pitch their tents was covered with Muslim soldiers. An unexpected event removed all obstacles. We have spoken of the seditious spirit of the Emirs, who, since the death of Malik Adel, had openly shown their ambitious designs and sought to introduce divisions into the Muslim armies. The most remarkable among these emirs was the leader of a troop of Kurds, named Imad Aden, 219, who had taken part in all the revolutions of Egypt 242, and Syria. Associated with the destinies of the sons of Al, this emir had witnessed the rise and fall of several Muslim dynasties, and held in contempt the powers of which he knew both the source and the origin. An intrepid soldier, a faithless subject, always ready to serve his sovereigns in fight or betray them in a conspiracy, Imad Aden could not endure a prince who reigned by the laws of peace, or recognize a power which was not the fruit of his intrigues or of a revolution. As fortune had always favored his audacity, and as all his treacheries had been well rewarded, every fresh revolt augmented his credit and his renown. An enemy to all acknowledged authority, the hope of all who aspired to empire, he was almost as redoubtable as the old man of the mountain, whose menaces made the most powerful monarchs tremble. Imad Aden resolved to change the government of Egypt, and conceived the project of decoming the Sultan of Cairo, and replacing him by another of the sons of Malik Adel. Several emirs were drawn into this conspiracy. On the day appointed, they were to enter the tent of Malik Kamel and compel him, by violence, to renounce the supreme authority. The Sultan was warned of the plot prepared against him, and on the eve of the day on which it was to be carried into effect, he left his camp in the middle of the night. The next day, at dawn, the conspirators were made aware that their designs had been discovered. They endeavored in vain to draw the soldiers into a revolt. The greatest confusion prevailed throughout the camp. Among the emirs, some gathered around Imad Aden and swore to follow his fortunes. Others, doubtful of the success of his enterprise, remained silent. Many took an oath to defend Malik Kamel. Amidst these debates, the Muslim army, conscious that they were without a leader, feared they might be surprised by the Christians. A panic terror all at once seized upon the soldiers, who abandoned their tents and their baggage, and rushed in the greatest disorder in the traces of their fugitive sultan. This retreat, of which the Christians could not imagine the cause, and which their historians explain by a miracle 243, from heaven 220, opened to them the passage of the Nile. The army hastened to cross the river, took possession of the Muslim camp, made a land's booty, and drew near to the walls of Damietta. The panic, however, which had put the Muslim troops to flight, had not at all communicated itself to the garrison of the city. This intrepid garrison offered the most vigorous resistance, and gave the army of Malik Kamel 221 time to recover from its fright. The Sultan of Damascus soon joined his brother the Sultan of Cairo. Imad Aden and the other leaders of the conspiracy were arrested and loaded with chains. Order and discipline were re-established among the Saracens, and the Christian army had to contend with all the united forces of the infidels, impatient to repair their check and recover the advantages they had lost. The burning days of summer were approaching. The Nile, increased by the rains of the tropics, began to issue from its bed. The Christian army was encamped under the walls of Damietta, having the Lake Menzal in its rear. The Saracens came and pitched their tents at a short distance from the camp of the Christians, who, oppressed by the consuming heat of the season and the climate, were subject every day to the spirited attacks of the infidels. In one of these conflicts, the Mussulmans got possession of a bridge which the Crusaders had thrown over the Nile. The banks of the river were covered with dead, and the Christian army only owed its safety to the heroic bravery of the Duke of Austria, the King of Jerusalem, and the Grand Masters of St. John and the Temple. Soon after, another battle was fought still more bloody than the first. In this fight, as it is described by James of Vitry, an ocular witness, not a person among the Christians was idle, the clergy were at prayers or attending the wounded, whilst the women and children carried water, wine, food, stones, and javelins to the combatants. Whirlwinds of scorching dust arose in the air and enveloped the two armies. The cries of the wounded and the dying, the sound of the trumpets, and the clashing 244 of arms resounded from the neighboring hills and from both shores of the Nile. Sometimes the Saracens were put to flight, and whole battalions, says James of Vitry, disappeared submerged in the Nile, as formerly the armies of Pharaoh perished in the Red Sea. Sometimes the Christians were repulsed in their turn, and left a great number of their warriors on the field of battle. The carnage lasted during the whole day, without either side being able to claim the victory. Whilst the two armies were contending with such fury on the banks, the Genoese and the Pisans, on board their vessels, made an attack upon the ramparts of the city. Several of their ships were consumed by the Greek fire, and the bravest of their soldiers were crushed beneath the beams and stones hurled from the top of the walls. At the approach of night, the Crusaders returned to their tents, despairing of ever being able to subdue the Saracens, and reproaching each other with want of courage in this unfortunate day. On the morrow, fresh disputes arose between the horse and foot soldiers, 222, each of which bodies accused the other with having been the cause of the losses the army had experienced. These debates became so warm that at length the foot and the horse both demanded, with loud cries, to be led again to battle, and rushed tumultuously out of the camp, to give convincing proofs of their bravery. The leaders could neither restrain nor direct the ardor and impetuosity of the soldiers, who fought in disorder, and were repulsed by the Saracens after horrible carnage. At this period a holy person, named Francis of Assisi, made his appearance in the Christian army, whose reputation for piety was spread throughout the Christian world, and had preceded him into the East. From his earliest youth, Francis had left the paternal roof to lead a life of edification. One day, whilst present at Mass in a church in Italy, he was struck with the passage of the Gospel in which our Savior says, "Take with you neither gold nor silver, nor other monies, neither scrips for the journey, nor sandals, 245, nor staff." From that period Francis had held in contempt all the riches of this world, and had devoted himself to the poverty of the apostles. He traveled through countries and cities, exhorting all people to penitence. The disciples who followed him braved the contempt of the multitude, and glorified themselves with it before God. When asked whence they came, they were accustomed to answer, "We are poor penitents from Assisi." Francis was led into Egypt by the fame of the crusade, and by the hope of their effecting some great conversion. The day preceding the last battle, he had a miraculous presentiment of the defeat of the Christians, and imparted his prediction to the leaders of the army, who heard him with indifference. Dissatisfied with the Crusaders, and devoured by the zeal of a mission from God, he then conceived a project of securing the triumph of the faith by his eloquence and the arms of the gospel alone. He directed his course towards the enemy's camp, put himself in the way of being taken prisoner by the Saracen soldiers, and was conducted into the presence of the Sultan. Then Francis addressed Melicamo, 223, and said to him, "It is God who sends me towards you, to point out to you the road to salvation." After these words, the missionary exhorted the Sultan 224 to 246, embraced the gospel. He challenged in his presence all the doctors of the law, and to confound imposture and prove the truth of the Christian religion, offered to cast himself into the midst of a burning funeral pile. The Sultan, astonished, ordered the zealous preacher from his presence, who obtained neither of the objects of his wishes. for he did not convert the Sultan, nor did he gather the palm of martyrdom. After this adventure, Saint Francis returned to Europe, where he founded the religious order of the Cordeliers, who at first, possessing neither churches, monasteries, glens, nor flocks, spread themselves throughout the West, laboring for the conversion of penitents. The disciples of Saint Francis sometimes carried the word of God among savage nations. Some went into Africa and Asia, seeking, as their master had done, errors to confute and evils to endure. They frequently planted the cross of Christ upon the lands of the infidels, and in their harmless pilgrimages, constantly repeated the scriptural words, "Peace be with you." They were only armed with their prayers, and aspired to no glory but that of dying for the faith. The Crusaders had been encamped 17 months before the walls of Damietta, and not a single day had passed without a murderous conflict. The Mussulmans, although they had obtained some advantages, began to lose all hope of triumphing over an enemy proof against the evils of war and an unhealthy climate. Report proclaimed the approaching arrival of the Emperor of Germany, who had taken the cross, and this news, whilst it sustained the courage of the Christians, made the Mussulmans tremble at the idea of having to contend with the most powerful of the monarchs of the West. The Sultan of Damascus, in the name of all the princes of his family, sent ambassadors to the camp of the Crusaders to ask for peace. He offered to abandon to the Franks the city and kingdom of Jerusalem, and only to reserve to themselves the places of Prague and Montreal, for which they proposed to pay tribute. As the ramparts and 247 towers of the Holy City had been recently destroyed, the Mussulmans engaged to pay $200,000 to re-establish them. They further agreed to give up all Christians made prisoners since the death of Saladin. The principal leaders of the Christian army were called together to deliberate upon the proposals of the Mussulmans. The King of Jerusalem, the French barons, the English, Dutch, and Germans were of opinion that the terms should be acceded to, and the peace accepted. The King of Jerusalem would regain his kingdom, and the barons of the West would see the happy end of a war that had detained them so long from their homes. By accepting the peace, they attained the object of the crusade, the deliverance of the holy places. The Christian warriors had besieged Damietta during 17 months, and the siege might be still prolonged. Many crusaders daily returned to Europe, whilst crowds of Muslim warriors as constantly joined the standards of the sultans of Cairo and Damascus. If they should take Damietta, they would be but too happy to exchange it for Jerusalem. The Mussulmans offered to give, before victory, quite as much as they could demand after having subdued them. It was not wise to refuse that which fortune offered to bestow upon them without conflicts or perils. The effusion of blood should be avoided, and they ought to reflect that victories purchased by the death of the soldiers of the cross were such as were most acceptable to the God of the Christians. The King of Jerusalem and most of the barons spoke thus, and indeed were to bring to their opinion the Italian nobles and the body of the prelates, whom Cardinal Pelagius led in an opposite direction. The legate of the Pope regarded himself as the head of this war, and he wished it to continue, in order to prolong his power and to procure for him additional renown. He could see nothing in the proposals of the enemy but a new artifice to delay the capture of Damietta and gain time. The Saracens offered nothing but desert countries and demolished cities, which would fall again into their power. Their only object was to disarm the Christians, and furnish them with a pretext for returning into the West. Things had gone too far to allow them to retreat without despair. It was disgraceful for Christians 248 to renounce the conquest of a city they had besieged 17 months, and which could hold out no longer. They must take possession of it first, and then they should know what was best to be done. Once masters of Damietta, the Crusaders might conclude a glorious peace, and reap all the advantages of victory. The motives alleged by Cardinal Pelagius were not unreasonable, but the spirit of party and faction reigned in the council of the leaders of the crusade. As it always happens in similar circumstances, everyone formed his opinion not upon that which he believed to be useful and just, but upon that which appeared most favorable to the party he had embraced. Some advised that the siege should be prosecuted, because the King of Jerusalem had offered a contrary opinion. Others wished the proposed capitulation should be accepted, because this capitulation was rejected by the legate of the Pope. The Christian army exhibited a strange spectacle. On one side, John of Brienne and the most renowned warriors were advocates for peace. On the other, the legate and most of the ecclesiastics demanded with great warmth the continuation of the war. They deliberated during several days without a chance of bringing the two parties to an agreement. And whilst the discussions become more intemperate, hostilities were renewed, then all the Crusaders united to prosecute the siege of Damietta. The Sultan of Cairo employed every means to throw supports into the city and keep up the courage of the garrison and the inhabitants. Some Muslim soldiers, taking advantage of the darkness of night, attempted to effect an entrance into the place. A few were able to gain and pass through the gates, but by far the greater number were surprised and massacred by the Crusaders, who kept constant and close watch around the walls. The news which the Sultan, Malik Kamel, received from Damietta became every day more alarming. The Muslim army, not daring to succor the besieged, remained inactive and confined themselves to the defense of their own entrenchments. Communication was soon entirely cut off between the place and the camp of the infidels. Some divers crossed the Nile through the Christian fleet, attained Damietta, and returned to inform the Sultan that pestilence, 249, famine, and despair reigned throughout the city. The Muslims had recourse to all sorts of stratagems to convey food to the garrison. Sometimes they filled leather sacks with provisions, which, being abandoned to the stream of the Nile, floated under the ramparts of the city. At others, they concealed loaves in the sheets that enveloped dead bodies, which, being borne on by the waters, were stopped in their course by the besieged. It was not long before these stratagems were discovered by the Christians, and then famine began to make horrible ravages. The soldiers, overcome by fatigue and weakened by hunger, had not the strength to fight or guard the towers and ramparts. The inhabitants, given up to despair, abandoned their houses, and fled from a city that presented nothing but images of death. Many came to implore the pity of the Crusaders. The commander of Damietta, whose name history has not preserved, in vain endeavored to keep up the courage of the people and the soldiers. To prevent desertion, he caused the gates of the city to be walled up. And from that period neither the Sultan of Cairo nor the Crusaders were able to know what was passing in the besieged place, in which a dismal silence reigned, and which, according to the expression of an Arabian author, was no longer anything but a closed sepulchre. The Christians had placed their machines at the foot of a tower, and as they saw no one defending it, the legate, at the head of the Italian Crusaders, took advantage of a dark and stormy night to penetrate within the first enclosure of the walls. The King of Jerusalem and the other leaders resolved at the same time to make an assault and enter the city, sword in hand. As soon as day appeared, the boldest descended into the tower, which they found deserted, and called aloud upon their companions to join them. The Christian army applauded their success, and answered by shouts of joy. The soldiers flew to arms, and instantly put the rams in motion. The walls were scaled, the gates were beaten to pieces, and a passage opened. The eager Crusaders rushed forward with naked swords and ready lances to encounter the enemy. But when they penetrated into the streets, a pestilential odor enveloped them, and the frightful spectacle made them recoil with horror. The public places, 250, the mosques, the houses, the whole city, were strewed with dead. 225, old age, infancy, ripened manhood, maiden beauty, matronly grace, all had perished in the horrors of the siege. At the arrival of the Crusaders, Damietta contained 70,000 inhabitants. Of these only 3,000 of the most robust remained, who, ready to expire, glided like pale, fading shadows among tombs and ruins. This horrible spectacle touched the hearts of the Crusaders, and mingled a feeling of sadness with the joy their victory created. The conquerors found in Damietta immense stores of spices, diamonds, and precious stuffs. When they had pillaged the city, it might have been believed, says an historian, that the warriors of the West had conquered Persia, Arabia, and the Indies. The ecclesiastics launched the thunders of excommunication against all who secreted any part of the booty. But these menaces had no effect upon the cupidity of the soldiers. All the wealth brought to the public stock only produced 200,000 crowns, which were distributed among the troops of the victorious army. Damietta boasted a celebrated mosque, ornamented by 6 vast galleries and 150 columns of marble, surmounted by a superb dome, which towered above all the other edifices of the city. This mosque, in which, On the preceding evening, Mussulmans had lifted their imploring, tearful eyes to their prophet, was consecrated to the Virgin Mother of Christ, and the whole Christian army came thither to offer up thanks to heaven for the triumph granted to arms. On the following day the barons and prelates 251 assembled in the same place to deliberate upon their conquest. And, by a unanimous resolution, the city of Damietta was assigned to the King of Jerusalem. They then turned their attention to the fate of the unfortunate inhabitants who had escaped pestilence and famine. James of Vitry, when describing the miseries of Damietta, and speaking of the horrible famine which swept away so many families during the siege, sheds tears over the little children who in vain asked their dead parents for bread. 226. The fate of such of us as remained alive inspired the virtuous Bishop of Ptolemy with pity, and he purchased many of them, in order to have them baptized and brought up in the Christian religion. The pious charity of the prelate, however, could only procure them eternal life, for they almost all died after having been baptized. All the Mussulmans who had sufficient strength to work received liberty and bread, and were employed in cleansing and purifying the city. Whilst the leaders were thus watching over a mourning city, and gave their anxious attentions to prevent new calamities, the spectacle that Damietta presented, and the empoisoned air they breathed within its walls, obliged the Christian army to return to their camp, and wait for the time at which the conquered city might be inhabited without danger. When the news of the taking of Damietta was spread through Syria and Upper Egypt, the Mussulman nations, seized with terror, flew to their mosques to implore the intervention of their prophet against the enemies of Islamism. The sultans of Cairo and Damascus sent ambassadors to the Caliph of Baghdad, conjuring him to exhort all true believers to take arms to defend the religion of Muhammad. The Caliph contemplated with grief the calamities about to fall upon the princes of the family of Saladin. But other dangers threatened him more nearly. Tartar hordes had issued from their mountains, invaded several provinces of Persia, and were advancing towards the Euphrates. The Caliph, far from being able to assist the Mussulmans of Syria 252, and Egypt by prayers and exhortations, invoked their support to defend his capital, and turn aside the storm ready to burst over the home east. When the Muslim ambassadors returned to Damascus and Cairo, their accounts added new alarms to those which the conquests of the Christians had already inspired. The Ubaid princes, however, did not delay endeavoring to unite all their efforts against the Crusaders, postponing, to a more favorable moment, the defense of the head of Islamism. The Muslim nations had a much greater dread of the invasion of the Christians than of the eruptions of the hordes of Tartary. The conquerors whom nations fear the most are those that desire to change the laws and religion of the conquered country. The Tartars, whose habits and manners were not formed, easily complied with those of the people they subdued. The Christians, on the contrary, only made war to destroy all and enslave all. Already rich cities, great provinces, were in their power. Everything had changed its form under their domination. Thus the Muslim princes and people, from the Euphrates to the Red Sea, forgot or neglected the storm which growled over Persia and was advancing slowly towards Syria, and resolved to take arms against the Crusaders, who were masters of the Nile. After the taking of Damietta, the Muslim soldiers who defended Egypt were struck with such excessive fear, that, during several days, not one of them durst face a Christian soldier. The Egyptian warriors who guarded the fortress of Tanis, built beyond the Lake Manzal, abandoned their ramparts at the approach of a few crusaders, and thus one of the firmest bulwarks of the Muslim Empire fell without defense into the hands of the Franks. From that time, the Christians had reason to believe they had no more enemies on the banks of the Nile. And, during the rigors of winter, many of the pilgrims returned to Europe. Half the army took advantage of the March passage to quit Egypt. Such as remained under the banners of the crusade forgot the labors and perils of war, and gave themselves up to indulgence and voluptuousness, to all the pleasure which the approach of spring, and the fine climate and beautiful sky of Damietta inspired. 253. During the leisure of peace, the divisions which had so often interrupted the course of the war, soon revived. The taking of Damietta had inflamed the pride of Cardinal Pelagius, who, in the Christian army, spoke as a conqueror and commanded as a master. The king of Jerusalem was so dissatisfied that he abandoned the city that had been given to him, and quitted an army of which he was the head, to retire to Ptolemy. New crusaders, however, eager to signalize their valor against the Mussulmans, arrived daily. The Duke of Bavaria, with 400 German knights and barons, sent by Frederick II, landed on the banks of the Nile. A short time afterwards, the Christian army received into its ranks crusaders from Milan, Pisa, and Genoa, and prelates and archbishops conducted a crowd of defenders of the cross, who came from the various provinces of Germany, and from France and Italy. The sovereign pontiff had neglected nothing to secure the success of the Holy War. He sent to Cardinal Pelagius provisions for the army, and a considerable sum of money, partly from his own treasury, and partly from the charity of the faithful of the West. 227. The legate was desirous of profiting by the succors he had just received, and proposed to follow up the war, and march directly against the capital of Egypt. The clergy adopted the advice of Pelagius, but such of the crusaders as saw would disgust a prelate at the head of warriors, refused to take up arms. The Duke of Bavaria and the barons and knights would acknowledge no leader but the King of Jerusalem. The legate Pelagius was obliged to send deputies to John of Brienne, who, pressed by the Pope himself, was at length prevailed upon, and consented, after an absence of several months, to come back and take the command of the army. Whilst the Crusaders remained thus in inaction, all the Mussulmans were flying to arms. The sultans of Damascus and Aleppo, the princes of Hama, Balbec, and of Arabia, assembled fresh armies. After the taking of Damietta, the Sultan of Cairo had retired, with his troops, to the spot where 254, the two eastern branches of the Nile separate. There he daily beheld troops of Mussulman warriors join his standard, and, awaiting a favorable opportunity, he constructed a palace in the center of his camp, surrounded by walls. The Mussulmans there built houses, baths, and bazaars, and the camp of the Sultan became a city, called Mansura, which was destined to be celebrated in history by the defeat and ruin of the Christian armies. As soon as the King of Jerusalem returned to Damietta, the leaders of the Crusaders assembled in council, to deliberate upon what they had to do. The legate of the Pope was the first to offer his opinion, and proposed to march against the capital of Egypt. We must attack the evil at its source, and, in order to conquer the Saracens, destroy the foundation of their power. Egypt supplies them with soldiers, provisions, and arms. By taking possession of Egypt, we should cut off all their resources. At no period were the soldiers of the cross animated by more zeal. Never were the infidels more depressed. To lose such an opportunity was to betray the common cause. When a great empire was attacked, prudence commanded the assailants not to lay down their arms till they had subdued it. By stopping after the first victory, they exhibited more weakness than moderation. The eyes of the whole Christian world were upon the army of the Crusaders. It was not only the deliverance of the holy places that was looked for from their valor, but the death of all the enemies of Christ, the destruction of every nation that had imposed a sacrilegious yoke upon the city of God. The bishops, the prelates, and most of the ecclesiastics were loud in their applause of the speech of the legate. But John of Brienne, who did not at all partake of their opinion, arose, and protesting his devotion to the cause of Christ, began by appealing to the assembly, if anyone could be more interested in the conquests of the Christians in the East, than the man who had the honor to be King of Jerusalem. He then pointed out how imprudent it would be to go up the Nile at the very moment at which that river was beginning to overflow, and would most likely inundate the roads which led to Cairo. Mark, said he, all the perils of the expedition proposed to you. We are to march into an unknown 255 land, through the midst of an enemy's country. If conquered, there can be no place of asylum for us. If conquerors, our victories will only weaken our army. However easy it may be for us to conquer provinces, it will be almost impossible for us to defend them. The Crusaders, always eager to return to Europe, are incalculably more serviceable in gaining battle than in securing the possession of conquered countries. Nobody can suppose that with the brave bands that surround us, we entertain any fear of the Mussulman armies which are gathering together from all parts. But in order to secure our safety, we must not only subdue our enemies, we must destroy them. We have not to deal with an army, but with an entire nation animated by despair. The whole Mussulman race are about to become so many intrepid soldiers, impatient to shed their blood in the field of battle. But what do I say? we shall have much less to dread from their courage than from their timid prudence. They will not fail to shun the fight, and will wait until diseases, want, fatigue, discord, the inconstancy of men's minds, the overflowing of the Nile, and the heat of the climate shall have triumphed over our efforts and secured the failure of all our enterprises. John of Brienne strengthened his opinion by other motives, with which his knowledge of the art of war supplied him, and terminated his speech by saying that Damietta and Tanis were powerful enough to restrain the people of Egypt, that it was necessary to recapture the cities they had lost, before they thought of conquering countries that had never been in their possession, and that, in short, they had not assembled under the banners of the cross to besiege Thebes, Babylon, or Memphis, but to deliver Jerusalem, which opened its gates to the Christians, and which they could fortify against all the attacks of the infidels. This moderate and pacific language would well have become the mouth of an envoy of the Pope. But Pelagius listened to the king of Jerusalem with the most evident impatience. He answered that weakness and timidity screened themselves behind the veil of moderation and prudence, that Christ did not summon to his defense such wise and far-sighted soldiers, but warriors who sought for battle rather than for reasons, and who could see the glory of an 256 enterprise, and be blind to its dangers. The legate added several more reasons to those he had already advanced, and expressed them with great bitterness. At length, led away by the heat of the discussion, he threatened all those who did not partake of his opinions with excommunication. Most of the leaders, and the king of Jerusalem himself, fearing to be excommunicated, but dreading much more to see the least suspicion cast upon their bravery, at length yielded to the obstinate will of Pelagius. The council of the barons and the bishops decided that the Christian army should leave Damietta, and march against the capital of Egypt. This army, composed of more than 70,000 men, advanced up the banks of the Nile. A numerous fleet, laden with provisions, arms, and machines of war, ascended the river at the same time. The Christian army passed through Fairskar and several other villages that had been abandoned by their inhabitants. All fled away at the approach of the Crusaders, who began to believe they should meet with no obstacle to their victories, and celebrated, beforehand, the conquest of Memphis and Cairo. The legate of the Pope exulted in the resolution he had dictated to the Christian army, and, full of confidence in a prediction that had been made concerning him in his youth, the presumptuous cardinal flattered himself that he was about to overthrow the worship of Mohammed, and indulged in the most insulting railleries against those who had been opposed to the war. Without fighting a single battle, the Christians gained the extremity of the delta, at the angle formed by the arm of the river which descends towards Damietta and the canal of Ammon, whose waters flow into the sea on the eastern side. The Saracens were encamped in the plain of Mansura, on the opposite bank of the river. The Crusaders halted on the hither shore, and their fleet cast anchor as near to them as possible. The Sultan of Damascus, and the princes of Aleppo, Baalbek, Hama, and Basra, had united their troops with those of the Sultan of Cairo. The Nile, whose bank was covered with entrenchments, presented a barrier very difficult to be overcome. But Malik Kamel did not dare to match himself with the Crusaders. Dreading their rash 257 bravery, so accustomed to sport with perils and triumph over all obstacles. Reports of the arrival of Frederick, and of the approach of the Tartars, kept the Mussulmans in a continual state of alarm, and made them anxious to terminate a war which exhausted their resources, consumed their strength, and did not promise them, even in victory, a compensation for so many efforts and so many sacrifices. Ambassadors were sent to propose peace to the leaders of the Christian army. The Mussulmans offered their enemies, if they would consent to an entire cessation of hostilities, to give up to them Damietta and its territories, and to restore Jerusalem, with all the places of Palestine that had been conquered by Saladin. These conditions assured to the Christians all the advantages of both war and peace. The king of Jerusalem, and most of the barons, who saw the difficulties and perils of the expedition they had entered upon, listened with as much surprise as joy to the proposals of the infidels, and did not hesitate to accept them. But they had absolutely no power in the army. The legate, who exercised an arbitrary authority, and who was constantly dreaming of conquests, persisted in thinking that these pacific proposals were only the effects of fear, and that the enemy who sued for peace was the one with whom war should be prosecuted with most spirit. the ambassadors returned to the camp of the Muslims to announce that the Christians refused the peace. Their account excited indignation, and indignation roused courage. When the Ubaid princes proposed peace, they were in possession of ample means to carry on the war with advantage. They every day received reinforcements, and their camp rapidly assumed a more formidable aspect. But soon a terrible auxiliary, against whose attacks Pelagius had no defense, came to the assistance of the Muslims, and procured them a complete triumph without either battles or danger. The Christian warriors, who flattered themselves they had now only to deal with a conquered enemy, were satisfied with surrounding their camp with a ditch and a wall. The army remained for several days in this position, without making an effort either to attack the Saracens or pass the Nile. Pelagius, who was constantly promising victory to 258, his soldiers, remained, nevertheless, in a state of inactivity in his tent. During this period, many of the Crusaders grew weary of a war in which no battles were fought. Some fancied that the cause no longer stood in need of their assistance, whilst others, with more foresight, feared coming reverses. More than 10,000 Crusaders abandoned the camp and returned to Damietta. The Christian army had been for more than a month in face of the enemy, always in expectation of the victories that had been promised to them. At length, the overflowing of the Nile, in a most alarming manner, disturbed their imagined security. The Saracens opened the sluices, and filled all the canals of Lower Egypt. The Mussulman fleet, which had not been able to ascend the Nile by Damietta, took advantage of the canals, and came up with the Christian ships. In a single engagement, the vessels of the Crusaders were almost all dispersed and consumed by the Greek fire. From that moment terror seized upon the Christians, for they were in want of provisions, and had neither means nor hopes of obtaining any. The Saracens, after having crossed the Nile on bridges, occupied all the circumjacent hills. The Christian soldiers wandered about the fields at hazard, pursued by the waves of the rising river, and by the Mussulmans, whose bravery they had so lately held in contempt. The whole army was on the point of being submerged or perishing with hunger, and had no hope but in the clemency of an enemy with whom they had recently refused to make peace. In this extremity, the King of Jerusalem and the principal leaders of the Christians sent several of their knights to offer the Saracens battle. But the latter were neither sufficiently imprudent, nor sufficiently generous to accept a proposal dictated by despair. The Crusaders were exhausted with hunger and fatigue. The cavalry sunk into, and encumbered by mud and slime, could neither advance nor retreat. The foot soldiers cast away their arms. The baggage of the army floated away upon the waters, and nothing was heard but groans and lamentations, when the Christian warriors, says an Arabian historian, saw nothing before them but death. Their minds sank into a state of despondency, and their backs bent beneath the rod of God, to whom be all praise. 259. Pelagius must then have been sensible of the full extent of his error. His project of marching to Cairo had, doubtless, something great in it, if it could have been executed. But the presumptuous legate disdained all counsels, all lessons of experience, and foresaw none of the obstacles he was certain to meet with on his route. He conducted an army filled with discontent. The soldiers had neither that confidence nor that enthusiasm that leads men to brave dangers or cheerfully encounter fatigue. The King of Jerusalem, the Duke of Bavaria, and a great number of the barons were his personal enemies, and took very little interest in the success of an enterprise of which they had disapproved. Amidst the cries and lamentations of an army to which he had promised victory, Pelagius was obliged to negotiate for peace, and his pride humbled itself so far as to implore the clemency of the Saracens. Christian ambassadors, among whom was the Bishop of Ptolemy, went to propose a capitulation to the conquerors. They offered to give up the city of Damietta, and only asked for the Christian army liberty to return to Ptolemy. The Mussulman princes assembled in council to deliberate upon the proposals of the Crusaders. Some were of opinion they should be accepted. Others declared that all the Christians ought to be made prisoners of war. Among those who proposed the harshest measures, the Sultan of Damascus, an implacable enemy of the Franks, was conspicuous. "No treaty can be made," said he, "with warriors without humanity and without faith. We should remember their barbarities in war and their treachery in peace. They arm themselves to ravage provinces, to destroy cities, and overthrow the worship of Muhammad. Since fortune has placed these most cruel enemies of Islamism, these devastators of the East, in the hands of the true believers, we ought to immolate them to the safety of the Muslim nations, and take advantage of our victory that will create a terror among the people of the West forever. Most of the princes and emirs, animated by fanaticism and vengeance, applauded this violent speech. The Sultan of Cairo, more moderate, and, doubtless, more prescient than the other leaders, dreading likewise the arrival of Frederick and the invasion of the Tartars, cultivated the opinion of 216, the Sultan of Damascus, and advised that the capitulation of the Franks should be accepted. All the Franks were not comprised in this army now in their power. Other crusaders guarded Damietta, and might be able to defend it. The Mussulmans had sustained a siege of 8 months, the Christians might hold out as long. It was more advantageous for the princes of the family of Saladin to return to their cities than to retain a few of their enemies in chains. If they destroyed one Christian army, the West, to avenge the defeat of its warriors, was able to send numberless legions into the East. They ought not to forget that the Muslim armies had lost a portion of that spirit of obedience and discipline that was the sole guarantee of victory. That they were worn out with fatigue, and sighed for repose. Other enemies in the now disarmed Christians, other perils than those they had just escaped, might soon hang over both Syria and Egypt. 228. It was wise to make peace at this moment, in order to prepare for fresh contests, for new wars, perhaps much more cruel than that which they had now an opportunity of terminating with so much glory to the Muslim arms. The speech of Melik Kamel brought back the princes of his family to sentiments of moderation. 229. The capitulation was accepted. The Sultan of Cairo sent his own son to the camp of the Christians as a pledge for his word. The King of Jerusalem, the Duke of Bavaria, the legate of the Pope, and the principal leaders repaired to the camp of the Saracens, and remained as hostages till the accomplishment of the treaty. When the deputies of the imprisoned army came to Damietta 261, and announced the disasters and captivity of the Christians, their account drew tears from the crowd of crusaders who at that time arrived from the West. When these same deputies informed them that the city must be given up to the infidels, the most intrepid of the Franks could not restrain their indignation, and refused to recognize a treaty so disgraceful to the soldiers of the cross. The greatest tumult prevailed throughout the city. Some, filled with despair, determined to return to Europe, and prepared to desert the banners of the cross. Others ran towards the ramparts, and getting possession of the towers, swore to defend them. A few days after, fresh deputies arrived to declare that the King of Jerusalem and the other leaders of the army would be obliged to give up Ptolemy to the Mussulmans if they refused to surrender Damietta. In order to overcome the obstinate resistance of those who wished to defend the city, and who reproached the imprisoned army with disgracing the Christians, they added that this army, though defeated, had obtained a prize worthy of their former exploits, for the Saracens had engaged to restore to them the true cross of the Savior, which had fallen into the hands of Saladin at the Battle of Tiberias. The fear of losing Ptolemy, the hope of regaining the cross of Christ, together with the speeches of the deputies, brought back the spirit of peace and resignation to the minds of the most ardent of the Crusaders, and disposed them to the performance of the conditions of the treaty. In the meantime, the Christian army, having lost their tents and their baggage, passed many days and many nights in a plain covered with the waters of the Nile. Hunger, disease, and inundation threatened their entire destruction. The King of Jerusalem, then in the camp of the Saracens, upon being informed of the horrible distress of the Christians, went to conjure Melik Kamel to have pity on his disarmed enemies. The continuator of William of Tyre, who is our guide in this part of our history, reports, in his old, quaint language, the touching interview between John of Brienne and the Sultan of Egypt. The king sat down before the Sultan, and began to weep. The Sultan, on seeing the king weep, said, "Sire, why do you weep?" "Sire, I 262, have good cause," replied the king, "for I behold the people whom God has confided to me perishing amidst the waters, and dying with hunger." The Sultan felt great pity at seeing the king weep, and he wept also. Then he sent 30,000 loaves to the poor as well as the rich, and sent the same quantity daily during 4 days. 230. Melik Kamel caused the sluices to be closed, and the waters rapidly retired from the plain. As soon as Damietta was surrendered to the Mussulmans, the Christian army began its retreat. The Crusaders, who owed their liberty and lives to the mercy of the Saracens, passed through the city which had cost them so many conflicts and so much labor. And, weeping, quitted the banks of the Nile, where so short a time before they had sworn to make the cause of Christ triumphant. They bore away in sadness the wood of the true cross, the identity of which they had reason to suspect, since it no longer performed miracles, and was not for them now the signal of victory. The Sultan of Egypt caused them to be accompanied by his son, who had orders to provide for all their wants on the route. The Saracen leaders were impatient to get rid of an army that had threatened their empire. They could scarcely give credit to their own triumph, and some little apprehension was, no doubt, mingled with the pity with which their conquered enemies inspired them. Great rejoicings had been made at Ptolemy for the victories obtained by the Christians on the banks of the Nile. They believed that they already saw the holy places delivered, and the empire of the Saracens destroyed. Consternation took place of their joy on seeing the army return. As in all the other reverses which their arms had met with, the Christians mutually reproached each other with their defeat. They accused the leaders of ambition, and the king of Jerusalem of weakness. The Templars and Hospitallers, who had 263, on all occasions set an example of courage and the most generous devotedness, were obliged to make a public apology for their conduct. When it became known in the west that Damietta had fallen again into the hands of the Saracens, all the faithful were affected by the deepest grief, 231, and sought, by their prayers, to mitigate the anger of heaven. Violent murmurs arose against the legate Pelagius, and represented him to the sovereign pontiff as the author of all the disasters of the crusade. But Honorius was not willing to condemn his minister, and reproached Frederick, who had 3 times renewed his vow to fight against the infidels, with having remained an idle spectator of an unfortunate war, and with having neglected to succor his brethren of the East. Frederick, who had sent vessels, provisions, and soldiers to the Holy War, thought that he had fully performed his part in the crusade, and was at first much astonished at the reproaches of the Holy See. When the Pope threatened him with the anger of heaven and the thunders of Rome, he could not restrain his indignation. In his letters the Emperor complains bitterly of the tyranny of both Innocent and Honorius, and talks of opposing war to war, and vengeance to injustice. After this, Honorius, who acted less from the dictates of his own mind than after the policy of his predecessors, changed his tone, attempted to justify both Innocent and himself, and, employing prayers instead of menaces, conjured Frederick to have pity on the Church of the East. This paternal language appeased Frederick. In an interview which he had with the Pope at Veroli, the Emperor of Germany repeated his vow to repair to Palestine at the head of an army. In another assembly, which was held some time afterwards at Verona, the Pope endeavored to engage Frederick, on account of his own interests. He proposed to him to espouse Yolande, daughter of John of Brienne, and heir to the kingdom of Jerusalem. The Grand Masters of the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Order, with the Patriarch and the King of Jerusalem, all summoned to Italy to deliberate on the affairs of the crusade, approved of a union which would secure them the assistance of a powerful 264 monarch. Frederick accepted a kingdom which he promised to defend, and consented to undergo excommunication if he failed in his promises. After the conference of Verona, King John of Brienne visited the principal states of Europe, for the purpose of soliciting aid for the Holy Land. At the time of John's arrival in France, the French were mourning the death of Philip Augustus. The King of Jerusalem assisted at the funeral ceremonies of his master and benefactor, who, at his death, had bequeathed 3,000 silver marks to the defenders of Palestine. After having paid the last duties to Philip, John went first to England, and afterwards to Germany, in both of which countries his presence and his discourses strongly moved Christians with the misfortunes of the Holy Land. The Emperor Frederick, on his part, made all the requisite preparations for an expedition which he was to lead in person. He ordered vessels to be constructed in all the ports of Sicily for transporting the Crusaders. Heaven and earth, wrote he to the Pope, are witnesses that I desire the success of the Christian arms with my whole soul, and that I will neglect nothing that can assist in securing the success of the holy enterprise. In all his letters Frederick exhorted the sovereign pontiff to employ every means to augment the numbers of the soldiers of Christ. Become, All at once, more zealous for the crusade than the Pope himself, he reproached the court of Rome with being sparing in indulgences, and with confining the preaching of the crusade to vulgar orders. He advised the Pope to redouble his efforts to appease the quarrels of Christian princes, and to compel the kings of France and England to sign a peace, in order that the nobles and people of these two kingdoms might take part in the crusade. Frederick, not being able to go into Germany, sent thither the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, with directions to exhort the Landgrave of Thuringia, the Duke of Austria, the King of Hungary, and the other princes of the empire, to take the oath to fight against the infidels. He undertook to furnish the Crusaders with vessels, provisions, arms, and everything necessary for the expedition beyond the sea. In short, he displayed so much activity, and showed so much ardor and zeal, that all 265, the attention of the Christians was directed towards him, and he was considered as the soul, the moving principle, and the head of the holy enterprise. The Christians of Palestine placed all their hopes in him. The Patriarch of Alexandria, in a letter to the Pope, said that they looked for the Emperor of Germany on the banks of the Nile and the Jordan, as formerly the saints had looked for the coming of the Messiah or Savior of the world. The Patriarch spoke with grief of the oppression and servitude that had been inflicted upon the Christians established in Egypt since the last invasion of the Crusaders. The unfortunate disciples of Christ were not allowed to keep in their dwellings either arms or horses, nor even to bear a crucifix at the funeral processions of their relations. 115 of their churches had been destroyed since the conquest of Damietta. Oppressed by tributes, 232, condemned to disgraceful labors, banished from their homes, wandering around their temples and their altars, they invoked the mercy of heaven and the valor of the warriors of the West for their deliverance. The report of Frederick's preparations was spread even to the remote nations of Georgia. And the queen of that country wrote to the head of the Church of Rome, that the constable of her kingdom and a great number of warriors only waited for the arrival of the Emperor of Germany, to fly to the assistance of Palestine. The Georgians had the reputation of being a warlike people, and were dreaded by the Mussulmans. Their pilgrims enjoyed the privilege of entering Jerusalem without paying the tribute imposed upon other Christians. When the Sultan of Damascus caused the ramparts of the holy city to be destroyed, the warriors of Georgia swore to avenge the outrage committed on the city of God. But an invasion of the Tartars prevented them from leaving their own territories. 233, since that 266 period, the hordes of Tartary having directed their ravages towards other countries, the Crusaders of Caucasus and the shores of the Caspian Sea promised to unite themselves in the plains of Syria and Egypt, with the Crusaders from the banks of the Rhine and the Danube. Frederick, however, was not yet in a position to perform his so often repeated promises. The Kingdom of Sicily and Naples contained germs of discord and rebellion. The republics of Lombardy were openly opposed to the Emperor of Germany. And the Holy See, which observed with anxiety the ambitious projects of Frederick upon Italy, encouraged all the enemies of a power of which it dreaded the too close neighborhood. Thus, the policy of the court at Rome, the revolts of Sicily, and the enterprises of the Italian republics, would not allow the emperor to lead his armies into Asia. Frederick demanded of the Pope the indulgence of a delay of 2 years for the performance of his vow. Founding his request upon the length of time required for assembling his armies, and declared that he was not willing to begin the war before the expiration of the truce made with the Mussulmans, thus showing much more respect for treaties with infidels than had till that time been common among Christians, indeed, more respect than he had himself shown. The Pope, although much dissatisfied, could not refuse the delay the Emperor demanded. He, however, dissembled his anger, and contented himself with requiring fresh promises, which were made, as all the rest had been, with the greatest solemnity. The new vows of Frederick were strengthened by his marriage with the heir of the King of Jerusalem. The marriage was celebrated at Rome, amidst the benedictions of the clergy and the acclamations of the people. All the Christians of the West heard of it with joy, and this union appeared to them to be the most certain pledge of the victories the Crusaders would gain over the infidels. John of Brienne, who assisted at the ceremony, congratulated himself upon having obtained an emperor for his son-in-law and a supporter. But his joy was not of long duration. Frederick, after his marriage, only saw in him the brother of that Gauthier de Brienne, who had borne the title of King of Naples and Sicily. He considered him as an enemy to his power, a dangerous 267 rival, and he disputed the possession of the Kingdom of Jerusalem with him. The Pope was secretly pleased at this claim or pretension, as he hoped it would promote the interests of the crusade. Honorius was delighted to see the ambition of the emperor mix itself up with the great designs for the execution of which he was so anxious. Frederick was therefore acknowledged King of Jerusalem. Thus John of Brienne, who had always proved himself the most ardent apostle of the Holy War, deprived of his crown, and from that time a stranger to the affairs of Palestine, was obliged to wait in retirement and silence for a favorable opportunity to avenge himself on his son-in-law, and recover his kingdom. Frederick carried on his preparations for the Holy War, and appeared more than ever disposed to set out for the East. The crusade was preached, in the name of the head of the Church, in all the kingdoms of Europe. The sovereign pontiff wrote to the princes to exhort them to suspend their divisions and occupy themselves solely with the war beyond the sea. As hostilities had just been renewed between England and France, Honorius ordered Louis VIII to lay down his arms, and threatened him with excommunication if he did not immediately make peace. The King of France, before he obeyed the orders of the Pope, was desirous of completing the conquest of Poitou. And whilst the thunders of Rome were growling over his head, the people and clergy were returning heaven thanks for his victories, in every church of his kingdom. The war against the English was not the only obstacle to the departure of the French crusaders for the Holy Land. The exterminating crusade against the Albigeois was still going on, and Louis VIII took a more active interest in it than his father Philip had done. When Louis VIII had concluded a truce with England, he at length resolved to take the cross, and made a vow not to go and fight against the Saracens in Asia, but against the heretics in Languedoc. In this crusade the King of France had the double advantage of scarcely going out of his own territories, and of making conquests that might someday enlarge his kingdom. The lords and barons followed Louis into the southern provinces, and thought no more about the deliverance of Jerusalem. 268. At the same time the envoys of the Pope and the Emperor were busy in exhorting the nations of Germany to succor the Christians of Palestine. Their orations, which at first had great success, ended by diminishing both confidence and enthusiasm. As the Pope had recommended the preachers to be prodigal of the indulgences of the Church, the people beheld with astonishment the greatest criminals take the cross, and swear to expiate their sins by the holy pilgrimage. They remembered that Saint Bernard had called thieves and murderers to the defense of Christ. But opinions and morals began to change, and that which had succeeded in the preceding century was now only a source of reproach. The monk of Augsburg, a contemporary author, informs us that the facility granted to the most vicious of mankind to redeem their crimes by taking up arms and the cross, only served to increase great offenses, and cool the zeal of the true defenders of Christ. 234. The orders who preached the crusade in England gathered more fruit from their labors, but owed great part of their success to celestial phenomena, which came very opportunely to second their eloquence. A luminous crucifix, with the marks of the 5 wounds of the Saviour, appeared suddenly in the heavens. This miraculous spectacle greatly inflamed the enthusiasm of the people. And, if we may believe Matthew Paris, more than 60,000 English took the oath to arm themselves for the deliverance of the tomb of Christ. Spain was constantly the seat of a sanguinary war between the Moors and the Christians. The one party supported by warriors from Africa, the other by knights and soldiers from the provinces of France, fought battles every day without destroying their means of either attack or defense, amid such wars, in which, by turns, Muhammad and Christ were invoked. Spain was not likely to hear or attend to the complaints and appeals of Jerusalem. Another enthusiasm than that of the Crusades, an ardent desire for liberty, then agitated the finest countries of Italy. The greater part of the cities, acted upon by jealousy, and 269, the other passions of republics, were all at war among themselves, fighting sometimes for territory, and sometimes for independence. In all these small states, parties attacked and pursued each other with fury, and disputed the exercise of power, sword in hand. Some of the cities, principalities, and baronies invoked the authority of the Pope, others that of the Emperor of Germany. The factions of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines troubled every city, and created divisions in most families. These discords and civil wars naturally turned the attention of Christian nations from the Crusades. The cities of Lombardy had formed a powerful confederacy, which gave Frederick continual cause of inquietude, and detained him in the west. Honorius employed every means in his power to re-establish peace, and direct men's minds towards his darling object, and at last succeeded in getting the Lombard republics to join the Emperor of Germany for the deliverance of the holy places. Although the people had lost some portion of their enthusiasm for the Holy War, it was still possible to form a redoubtable army by gathering together all the warriors that had taken the cross in the various countries of Europe. And the new Crusaders were ordered to meet at the port of Brindisi, where vessels were being prepared to transport them to the east. On their arrival in the Kingdom of Naples, the Emperor of Germany supplied them with provisions and arms. Everything was ready, and the Pope was about, at length, to see his wishes accomplished, and receive the reward of all his labors and preachings, when inexorable death deprived Christendom of its head. Gregory IX, who succeeded him, had all the abilities, the virtues, and the ambition of Innocent III. In the execution of his designs, he feared neither difficulties nor perils. The most violent measures had no terrors for his obstinacy or audacity, when the triumph of his will was in question. Gregory had scarcely ascended the pontifical throne, when the preparations for the Holy War engrossed all his thoughts, and became the principal object of his active solicitude. The Crusaders assembled in Apulia had much to suffer from the influences of the climate and the season. The sovereign pontiff neglected nothing to alleviate their distresses and hasten their departure. He exhorted the emperor to 270 embark, by saying to him, "The Lord has placed you in this world as a cherubim with a flaming sword, to direct those who stray from the way of the tree of life." Frederick at length yielded to the prayers of the Pope, and sailed from the port of Brindisi with his fleet and army. Prayers were being put up for the prosperity of his voyage and the success of his expedition, in all the provinces of his empire, when, at the end of 3 days, being attacked by the malady that had made such ravages in the Christian army, he retraced his course, and landed in the port of Otranto. Gregory had celebrated the departure of Frederick as a triumph of the Church. He considered his return as an absolute revolt against the Holy See. The little city of Agnani, to which the Pope had retired, witnessed the rage of the pontiff, and beheld the birth of that formidable storm which so long disturbed the Christian world. Accompanied by the cardinals and several bishops, Gregory repaired to the principal church, and having mounted the pulpit, before the assembled people, he pronounced a sermon which had for its text, "It is necessary that scandals should arise." After having called upon the prophets, and spoken of the triumph of Saint Michael over the dragon, he launched against Frederick all the anathemas of the Church. The emperor at first sent messengers to the Pope to explain and justify his conduct. But the inexorable Gregory refused to listen to them, and complained to all the sovereigns of Europe, representing Frederick as a faithless and perjured prince. He accused him of having consigned his wife Yolande to close imprisonment, in which she died of grief; of having left the Crusaders to perish with hunger, thirst, and heat in the plains of Apulia; and of having, at last, under the frivolous pretext of sickness, violated his oath and deserted the banners of Christ, in order to return to the customary enjoyments of his kingdom. He made him many other reproaches, and in his anger called down upon him the maledictions of all Christians. Frederick, exceedingly irritated, replied to the accusations of Gregory with much bitterness. In his apology, which he sent to all the princes of Christendom, he complained strongly of the usurpations of the Holy See, and exposed, in the most odious colors, the policy and ambitious designs of 271, the court of Rome. "The Church of Rome," said he, "sends legates everywhere, with power to punish, to suspend, and excommunicate, not with the designs of spreading the word of God, but to heap up money, and reap that which they have not sown." The emperor reminded the princes, in his letters, of the violences which the Pope had exercised against the Count of Toulouse and the King of England. He said that the domains of the clergy did not now satisfy the ambition of the Holy See, and that the sovereign pontiffs wished to lay their hands upon every kingdom. From that moment open war was declared between the Pope and the Emperor. Neither of them possessed a pacific character or love of quiet. Both were animated by boundless ambition, jealous to excess of their power, implacable in their revenge, and always ready to employ the arms which the church or fortune placed in their hands. Gregory displayed an indefatigable activity, leaving his enemies no repose, but pursuing them at the same time with the thunders of religion and war. In addition to the arms of eloquence, the pontiff did not disdain to employ satire. The manifestos which he published against his adversaries constantly recall the spirit of the denunciations made by the prophets. These denunciations, mixed with obscure allegories, gave to his words a dark and mysterious tone, which caused him to be considered as the interpreter of angry heaven. Frederick was neither a less able prince nor a less redoubtable enemy. The art of war contained no stratagems or secrets with which he was unacquainted. Policy dictated no means that he scrupled to employ. Endowed with all the gifts of mind, and with a keen spirit of raillery, he was as competent to confound his enemies in a discussion, as to conquer them in the field of battle. Descended, on the female side, from those famous Normans who had conquered Sicily and the kingdom of Naples, he united, as they had done, courage with subtlety, and audacity with dissimulation. To please the court of Rome, he had made barbarous laws against heretics. And, now become the enemy of the popes, he did not fear to arm heretics or Saracens against the court of Rome. When the kingdom of Jerusalem was offered to him, he set no great value upon the acquisition. But he accepted it with joy, in order to increase his popularity in the Christian 272 world, and to arm himself, one day, against the sovereign pontiff with a title, which was then held in universal veneration. A war between such enemies must necessarily prove terrible, and spread desolation and confusion throughout Christendom. Gregory, on his return to Rome, repeated his excommunications in the Church of St. Peter Frederick, in order to revenge himself, seduced into his party most of the Roman nobles, who took up arms, insulted the sovereign pontiff at the very foot of the altar, and compelled him to abandon the capital of the Christian world. The Pope, driven from his states, pursued his enemy with more fury than ever. And, availing himself of the formidable authority of the Church, he released the subjects of Frederick from their oath of fidelity, by reminding them that they could owe no obedience to those who opposed themselves to God and his saints. On his side, Frederick drove the Templars and Hospitallers from the kingdom of Naples, plundered the churches, and ill-treated all ecclesiastics whom he suspected of being attached to the party of the Holy See. He sent troops to ravage the patrimony of St. Peter, and enlisted the Saracens established in Sicily, under the banners of a Christian prince, to combat the head of the Christian Church. The Roman states were ravaged, and given up to the horrors of war. The eyes of all Europe were fixed upon these deplorable scenes, and everyone seemed to have forgotten the Holy War. The Christians of Palestine, however, never ceased to implore aid from the West. A letter to the Pope from the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the bishops of Caesarea and Bethlehem, and the Grand Masters of the three military orders, painted in strong colors the despair into which the Christians of the East had fallen, when they learned that Frederick had deferred his departure. The Pope received their complaints with expressions of sorrow and kindness, and communicated them to the faithful with a greater zeal, from there furnishing him with a fresh opportunity of accusing the Emperor of Germany. But the nations of the West, occupied with their own dangers, and terrified at the sight of the violent storms that had recently burst forth, were not in the least moved by either the lamentations from Palestine or 273, the pressing exhortations of Gregory. In this unfortunate position of European affairs, the Christian colonies, abandoned to themselves and their own feeble resources, and a prey to the greatest disorders, must have been invaded and entirely destroyed, if Providence had not stirred up fresh discords among their enemies. During the siege of Damietta, the common danger had united the children of Malik Adel. After victory, ambition resumed the place of fear, and the Ubaid princes quarreled for the provinces which their union had wrested from the power, or saved from the invasion of the Christians. Conradin, Sultan of Damascus, dreading the views of Melik Kamel, called Jalaluddin, prince of the vast empire of Charismia, to his aid. The Sultan of Cairo, in great apprehension of the consequences of this alliance, turned his eyes towards the princes of the West. During alone of the preparations of Frederick had been a source of terror to the Muslim powers. The Emperor of Germany was considered, in the East, as the head of all the nations of Europe. The Sultan of Egypt attached the greatest importance to the disarming of a formidable enemy. And as the complaints of the Pope, and the report of the discords that had broken out among the Christians, had reached his ears, he conceived a hope of finding in Frederick a sincere ally and a powerful auxiliary. 235. Melik Kamel sent presents and ambassadors to the Emperor of Germany. He invited Frederick to come into the East, and promised to deliver Jerusalem up to him. This proposition gave the Emperor as much surprise as joy. And he, in reply, sent an ambassador into Egypt, to ascertain the exact intentions of the Sultan of Cairo, and offer him his friendship. The envoy of Frederick was received at the court of the Sultan with the greatest honors, and returned to announce to his master that Melik Kamel was ready to favor his expedition to Palestine. 274. This negotiation, with which the Pope and the Christians of the West were perfectly unacquainted, made Frederick determined to follow up the project of the crusade. He had, besides, several other motives for not renouncing the Eastern enterprise. He knew that John of Brienne was on the point of returning to Palestine, and resuming possession of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Pope continued to represent him as the enemy of Christ, and the scourge of Christians. To secure the failure of the plan of John of Brienne, and, at the same time, reply to the sovereign pontiff in a victorious manner, Frederick resolved to embark for the Holy Land. He was desirous of proclaiming his intention with the greatest pomp, and caused a magnificent throne to be erected in the plain of Barletta, which he ascended in the presence of an immense crowd of spectators. In all the splendor of imperial magnificence, he presented himself invested with the Pilgrim's Cross, and announced to the assembled people that he was about to set out for Syria. In order to give more solemnity to this pompous ceremony, and affect the hearts of the multitude, the emperor caused his will to be read with a loud voice. And the barons and nobles swore at the foot of the throne, to see that his last commands should be executed, if he should chance to lose his life either in the perils of the sea or the wars of the East. When the Pope learned this determination of Frederick's, he sent ecclesiastics to forbid him to embark. The sovereign pontiff reproached the emperor with presenting to the Christian world the scandal of a crusade directed by a prince reproved of God, as the fleet of Frederick consisted of only 20 galleys, and as he took with him only 600 knights. Gregory reproached him with not having fulfilled his promises, and compared his imprudent attempts to the expedition of a captain of pirates. The emperor did not condescend to make any reply to the messengers of the Pope. The more opposition the head of the church gave to his departure, the more impatient Frederick appeared to set out and accomplish his design. In his indignation, he congratulated himself at having to brave the anger of the church and the arms of the Saracens at the same time. He left the greater part of his army in Sicily, charging his 275 lieutenant, the Duke of Spoleto, to negotiate for peace with the Pope, but at the same time to carry on the war commenced against the Roman states with unabated vigor. When he heard of the departure of the emperor, Gregory was in little city of Assisi, occupied in the canonization of Saint Francis. During several days, he had sung nothing but hymns of hope and joy. Francis, said he, had appeared like the star of morning, like the orb of day, like the moon in its splendor. This language of peace, this festive pomp, were all at once interrupted by the maledictions that the Pope pronounced against Frederick. The sovereign pontiff repaired to the foot of the altar, and there implored heaven to confound the pride of impious monarchs, and frustrate all their sacrilegious enterprises. The emperor, notwithstanding, arrived safely on the coast of Syria, and was received at Ptolemy by the patriarch, the clergy, and the grand masters of the military orders. For some days, the Christians of the East viewed him as the liberator and the king of Jerusalem. But a change speedily took place. 2 disciples of Saint Francis, sent by the Pope, came to announce to the faithful that they had received a prince rebellious to the will of the Church. From that moment, contempt, hatred, and mistrust took place of respect and submission. They began by perceiving that Frederick was followed by only a small number of warriors, and that he had not troops enough to render him formidable to either the Saracens or the Christians. Nothing was talked of in Ptolemy but the excommunication of the Pope, and the means of withdrawing themselves from obedience to a heretic prince. Never had the deliverance of Jerusalem been less thought of. At the moment in which Frederick arrived in Syria, Conradin, Sultan of Damascus, died.
Oh,
And the death of this prince gave birth to more discords among the Mussulman powers.
no doubt
The
about that.
Principality of Damascus was governed by a young inexperienced prince. And the spirit of license and insubordination, which had, in the last wars, been already observed among the troops of Syria and Egypt, made,
trouble
every
on the
day,
rise and
greater
coming.
progress, and put all the Mussulman thrones in peril. The Sultan of Cairo, when informed of the arrival of 276,
Oh.
Frederick, came into Palestine at the head
honored.
of an army. Some asserted that he came to defend Jerusalem and to fight with the Christians. But his true design was to take advantage of the chances of war and of the discords which everywhere prevailed, to get possession of Damascus and defeat the plans of the enemies that jealousy and ambition had raised up against him among the Mussulmans and princes of his family. The Emperor of Germany marched out of Ptolemy at the head of his small army and directed his course towards the mountains of Naples. He had sent Count Thomas de Celano to Melitopol to remind him of his promises and to tell him that, being master of the most vast provinces of the West, he was not come into Asia for the purpose of making conquests. That he had no other design but that of visiting the holy places and taking possession of the kingdom of Jerusalem, which belonged to him. 236, the Sultan received the ambassador of Frederick with due respect. But whether he was ashamed to make peace before he had begun the war, or whether he feared to draw upon himself the hatred of the Mussulmans by showing too much deference for a Christian prince, he at first made no reply to the propositions that were made to him. Nevertheless, the two princes sent fresh ambassadors, charged on both sides to express a desire for peace. Both were placed in embarrassing circumstances, being surrounded by enemies who blamed their proceedings and did not allow them to publish all their sentiments freely. The Mussulman army from Damascus, encamped in the neighborhood of Jerusalem, watched all the movements of the Sultan of Egypt and seemed much more disposed to fight with him than to repulse the Christians. The Emperor of Germany found himself in the presence of two hostile armies, and that which he himself commanded inspired him with no more confidence than he inspired in it. The Hospitallers and Templars had left him and followed him at a distance. In the camp of the Christians no one durst pronounce the 277 name of the prince who commanded the army. Frederick had been obliged to withdraw the standard of the empire, and his orders were only issued to the soldiers of the cross in the name of God and of the Christian Republic. In this difficult situation, Frederick and Melitopol were equally sensible of the necessity for peace, and of the danger of commencing war. They therefore gave more employment to their ambassadors than to their soldiers. This crusade was nothing but a long negotiation, disapproved of by both Christians and infidels. As the two sovereigns covered their policy with a veil of profound mystery, it was easy for hatred to spread and procure countenance for sinister reports. Criminal intentions were discovered in the simplest actions. In the Christian army it was conceived that Frederick had committed a crime by sending his sword and cuirass to the Sultan of Cairo, as a pledge of his wish for peace. Among the Mussulmans, Melitopol was reproached with seeking an alliance with the enemies of Islamism, by sending to the leader of the Franks an elephant, some camels, and the rarest productions of Arabia, India, and Egypt. The scandal reached its height when the emperor received as a present from the Sultan of Cairo, a troop of girls, brought up, according to the custom of the Orientals, to sing and dance in the banqueting hall. At length prejudices were carried so far on both sides, that Frederick was judged more favorably of by his enemies than by his own army. And Melitopol would sooner have found grace among the Christians than among his own troops. The infidels regarded the Emperor of Germany as a prince full of wisdom and moderation. Avelfida, and all the Arabian authors, have celebrated the qualities and virtues of the monarch of the Franks, whilst the continuator of William of Tyre only speaks of this prince with bitterness, and reports in his history, that all the apostles and other Christians had great doubt and great suspicion that he was far gone in infidelity, and warm in his belief in the law of Mahomet. Hatred soon broke out in acts of treachery and the most odious plots. As the emperor had expressed an intention of going to bathe in the waters of the Jordan, the Templars addressed a letter to Melitopol, pointing out the means 278 of surprising the head of the Christian array in his pilgrimage. The Sultan of Cairo despised such treachery, and sent the letter he had received to Frederick. At the same time, Malik Kamel learned that the Sultan of Damascus had declared war against him, and would be joined by several other Muslim princes. The Sultan of Cairo and the Emperor of Germany had carried on their negotiations for peace during several months, but now, pressed on all sides by enemies, and surrounded by dangers, even in their own camp, they at length resolved to end the matter, and conclude a treaty, which would permit them to dispose of their forces for their security or for their personal ambition. They agreed between themselves that they would make a truce of 10 years, and that Jerusalem, Nazareth, Bethlehem, and Thoron should be given up to Frederick or his lieutenants. 237. According to the conditions of the treaty, the Mussulmans were to retain in the Holy City the Mosque of Omar in the free exercise of their worship. The Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli were not comprised in the treaty. The Emperor of Germany undertook to divert the Franks from every kind of hostility against the subjects or lands of the Sultan of Egypt. When the articles of the treaty became known in the two camps, the peace was considered by both as impious and sacrilegious. 238. The Imams and Cadis, invoking the name of the Caliph of Baghdad, loudly condemned a truce which conveyed away from the Mussulmans the holy city, which they 279 called the House of God, the city of the Prophet. The prelates and bishops, speaking in the name of the Pontiff of Rome, declaimed vehemently against a treaty which left mosques standing by the side of the Holy Sepulchre, and in some sort confounded the worship of Muhammad with that of Christ. When the envoy of the Emperor of Germany went to Damascus to procure the ratification of the treaty which had been concluded, the Sultan and his vizier refused to hear him. The peace made with the Christians was a subject of affliction and scandal for all true believers. One of the most celebrated orators of Islamism pronounced the panegyric of Jerusalem and the Great Mosque. And, when recalling in pathetic terms the loss the Mussulmans had experienced, he drew tears from all the assembled people. The Patriarch of Jerusalem placed an interdict upon the recovered holy places, and refused pilgrims permission to visit the sepulchre of Christ. Jerusalem was no longer, in the eyes of Christians, the holy city and the heritage of the Son of God. When the Emperor made his public entrance, the faithful preserved a sullen and melancholy silence as he passed along. Accompanied by the German barons and the Teutonic knights, he repaired to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was hung with mourning, and appeared as if guarded by the angel of reprobation. All the ecclesiastics had deserted the sanctuary, and everything wore the air of abomination and desolation. Frederick himself took the crown. In placing it upon his head, he was proclaimed King of Jerusalem without any religious ceremony. The images of the apostles were veiled. Nothing was seen around the altars but swords and lances. And the sacred vaults gave back no sounds but the noisy acclamations of warriors. After his coronation, Frederick wrote to the Pope and to all the princes of the West that he had reconquered Jerusalem without the effusion of blood. In his account he endeavored to enhance the splendor and merit of this victory, which must fulfill all the hopes of the Christian world. At the same time, the Patriarch wrote to Gregory and all the faithful of Christendom to show them the impiety and the disgrace of the treaty Frederick had just concluded. When he heard of the success of the Emperor, the sovereign pontiff deplored the conquest of Jerusalem as he would have 280, deplored its loss, and compared the new king of Judea to those impious monarchs whom the anger of God placed upon the throne of David. Frederick was not able to remain long in the holy city, which resounded with imprecations against him. He returned to Ptolemais, where he found only revolted subjects and Christians scandalized at his successes. The Patriarch and the clergy placed an interdict upon the city during the time the Emperor should remain in it. All religious worship was suspended. The altars were deprived of their ornaments, and the crosses, relics, and images of the saints were cast upon the ground. No more bells, no more religious hymns were to be heard. A melancholy silence prevailed in the sanctuary, where Mass was celebrated in a low voice, and with closed doors. The dead were buried in the fields, without funeral ceremonies or monumental stones. Everything, in short, denoted a season of great calamities, and a dread of the vengeance of heaven. It was thus that the liberator of Jerusalem was welcomed at Ptolemais. It was Passion Week, and this religious period gave additional influence to the clergy and more solemnity to the maledictions of the church. Frederick found himself obliged to negotiate for peace with the Christians, as he had done with the infidels, and being unable to regain their goodwill, he still further exasperated them by his violence. He caused the gates of the city to be closed, and prohibited the bringing in of provisions. He planted archers and arbaletiers in every place where they could insult the Templars and Pilgrims. And by his orders, mendicant preaching monks were dragged from the foot of the altar and beaten with rods in the public places of the city. Hatred and vengeance were carried, on both sides, to the greatest excess. It was impossible for the emperor, surrounded as he was by enemies, to remain long at Ptolemy, in addition to which motive, he daily received letters from Europe urging his return. Two formidable armies, under the banners of the Holy See, had entered the kingdom of Naples, pillaged the cities, ravaged the country, mutilated prisoners, and committed all kinds of enormities. These armies were under the command of John of Brienne, impatient to revenge his own injuries, and two Sicilian counts, 281, whom the Emperor of Germany had driven from the kingdom of Naples. Frederick at length quitted Palestine and returned to his own dominions. As he left Ptolemy, the inhabitants chanted hymns of deliverance and joy. He accused the Templars of having endeavored to deliver him up to the Saracens. The Templars, on their part, accused him of having wished to surrender all the Christian cities to the Sultan of Cairo. These accusations, and 1,000 others, dictated by hatred, ought to inspire the historian with great and just suspicions. The Christians might have urged against Frederick a much more reasonable reproach. He had taken no means to secure his conquest, and they were warranted in believing that he had only made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem with the view of annoying the Holy See, and dating a reply to the inculpations of Gregory from the holy places. Having attained his object, he had deceived the faithful, by inviting them to a city that he was disposed neither to defend nor fortify. In addition to this, Frederick himself felt very little pride in the advantages of which he made such a pompous display throughout Europe. And the crusade in which he had taken a part was frequently the object of his pleasantries and sarcasms. On his return to Italy, he found a much more serious war than that he had carried on in Asia. The Pope had not only levied troops to ravage his states, he had induced the Lombard republics to take up arms against him. John of Brienne, deprived of his title of King of Jerusalem, determined to endeavor to be acknowledged emperor, and his pretensions were supported by all that was then held most sacred, the authority of the Church and the right of victory. The presence of Frederick restored courage to his subjects, whose fidelity was still unshaken. He met his enemies in several engagements, in which he always gained the advantage. The army of John of Brienne was dispersed, and the pontifical troops quitted all the cities and provinces they had conquered, in the greatest disorder. The Pope, learning that fortune had deserted his banners, again had recourse to defenders of religion, and employed the most terrible of its denunciations against Frederick. He declared that all were excommunicated who should hold any 282 kind of commerce with the emperor, all who should sit at his table, be present at his councils, celebrate divine service before him, or offer him any mark of attachment or respect. Frederick was terrified at this sentence, which was published with great solemnity in all parts of Europe, particularly in his own dominions, and sent ambassadors to the Pope, who, in spite of the thunders with which he was armed, dreaded the consequences of war, and showed himself disposed to receive the submission of an enemy he dreaded. After a negotiation of several days, a treaty was made, in which the conquered Pope dictated laws to his conqueror, and appeared, whilst receiving peace, to accord a pardon. But in spite of this treaty of peace, the effects of discord still subsisted, and were felt even in the East, where debates, raised in the name of the Church, had divided men's minds, and oppressed the general courage. And where the Christian states, for which Europe had taken up arms, remained without support and without defense. As Frederick had abandoned Jerusalem without fortifying it, 239, the Christians were in constant dread of the invasion of the Muslim peasants, whom the hopes of pillage attracted from the mountains of Nablus. The great bell of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre often gave warning of the approach of an enemy eager for carnage. And most of the inhabitants retired with their terrified families, some to the fortress of St. David, which was still standing among the ruins, and others into desert places. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, the prelates, barons, and people of Palestine, who had no longer either a leader or a king, in vain implored the assistance of the warriors and princes of the West. Prayers and complaints so frequently repeated had no power to awaken in the hearts of the faithful either the sentiments of pity or the enthusiasm which had so often caused them to take up arms and the cross. They could have no faith in perils that followed so closely 283 upon victory. And they despaired of ever being able to assure the deliverance of a country which required to be delivered so often. The Pope, however, had not abandoned the project of the crusade, and still entertained the hope of reviving the ardor and zeal of the Christian warriors by his exhortations. He convoked an assembly at Spoleto, at which Frederick, with the patriarchs of Constantinople, Antioch, and Jerusalem assisted. It was resolved in this assembly to renew the war in Palestine. Notwithstanding the truce concluded with the Sultan of Cairo, Gregory was impatient to accomplish his designs, and proclaim the laws of the Church in the rich countries of the East. And, to employ the time till warriors could be gathered together, he sent several missionaries across the sea, armed with the sword and the word, to endeavor to convert the infidels of Syria and Egypt. The sovereign pontiff was so persuaded of the success of this Pacific crusade, that he wrote to the Caliph of Baghdad, the Sultan of Damascus, and the principal Mussulman chiefs, to exhort them to embrace Christianity. 240. History does not say what the fate was of these mendicant preachers in the East. But the Caliph of Baghdad and the Mussulman princes did not cease to be inveterate enemies to the Christians. Gregory IX was better inspired and more fortunate when he sent sacred orders into several of the provinces of the West, to appease the troubles and civil wars that were so injurious to the cause of religion, and diverted the minds of the people from the great enterprise of the Holy Wars. The disciples of Saint Dominic and Saint Francis of Assisi, charged with a mission worthy of the gospel, pervaded cities and countries, preaching peace and concord. Among the preachers thus sent to pacify states, Brother John of Vicentia made himself conspicuous by the miracles effected by his eloquence. 241. In all the countries he visited, the nobles, the peasants, the citizens, and the warriors flocked to listen to 284 him, and swore to pardon all injuries and terminate all quarrels. After having re-established peace in several cities troubled by the spirit of jealousy, and animated by the stormy passions of undefined, ill-understood liberty, he announced that he should preach in the plain of Peshira, on the banks of the Adige. All the inhabitants of the neighboring cities, headed by their clergy and their magistrates, repaired to the place appointed, to listen to the Angel of Concord 242, and the order of public peace. In the presence of more than 400,000 auditors, Brother John mounted a pulpit elevated in the center of the plain of Peshira. A profound silence prevailed throughout the assembly. Every eye was fixed upon the holy preacher. His words seemed to descend from heaven. He took for his text these words of the scripture, "I give you my peace, I leave you my peace." After having drawn a frightful picture of the evils of war and the effects of discord, he ordered the Lombard cities to renounce their enmities, and dictated to them, in the name of the Church, a treaty of universal pacification. At no period had the Middle Ages presented a more sublime and touching spectacle. The historian of that time, who has nothing but troubles and wars to describe, ought to be delighted at an opportunity to tell of such an imposing and solemn scene, wherein religion recalled assembled nations to a sense of all that her maxims contain that is most consoling and salutary. The discourse of Brother John filled his auditory with the holy love of peace, and the cities that it war swore, before him, to forget forever the subjects of their long divisions and eternal rivalries. These evangelical discourses restored to Italy a few days of peace, and gave the Holy See an opportunity of preaching a new crusade with success. Gregory addressed pastoral instructions to all the bishops and prelates of Christendom. In his letters to the French bishops, he applied these words of Christ to the holy war: "If anyone would come with me, let him renounce himself, let him take up my cross and follow me." The sovereign pontiff declared all who would not employ their utmost efforts to conquer the heritage of 285 Christ guilty of treason. The circulars of the Pope ordered all the faithful, of both sexes, to pay a dinar per week towards the expenses of the crusade. The head of the church compared these alms to those which St. Paul solicited for the poor of Jerusalem, and did not fear to assert, beforehand, that they would suffice for the maintenance of the army of crusaders for 10 years. The preaching of this crusade was confided to the fraternities of St. Dominic and St. Francis, which had, in Asia, missionaries for the conversion of infidels, and in the West, preachers to re-establish peace among Christians. The new apostles of the Holy War received from the Pope the power, not only to give the cross, but to commute the vow of pilgrimage to pecuniary alms, a practice that had never been seen since the beginning of the Crusades. They had likewise the faculty of granting indulgences for several days to all who came to listen to their sermons. According to the spirit of their institutions, the disciples of St. Francis and St. Dominic lived amidst austerities and penance. They devoted themselves to poverty, and were bound to furnish a constant example of Christian humility. But, in this instance, the Pope desired they should be received into monasteries and cities with pomp and ceremony, and that the clergy should come out to meet them, with the banners and most splendid ornaments of their churches. Whether this magnificence changed the simplicity of their manners, or that the people did not like to behold men whom they had lately seen devoted to evangelical poverty, treated with ceremonial pomp, the preachers of the crusade inspired their auditors with neither esteem nor respect, and the crowd diminished every day. As they received abundant alms, of which no one could see the employment, neither the solemnity of their mission nor the sanctity of their characters could screen them from the suspicions and accusations of the multitude. The murmurs and complaints which arose on all sides, at length weakened the authority of their words, and assisted in cooling the zeal and devotion of the Christians for the Holy War. The enthusiasm of the people, which Christian eloquence could not revive, stood in need of the example of the most illustrious princes and warriors. France was then at peace. 286. The war against the Albigeois was drawing towards its end. Most of the knights and barons, reared amidst battles, could not endure rest, and sighed for an opportunity of signalizing their warlike temperament. They took the oath to go into Asia and fought against the Saracens. Thibaut, Count of Champagne, and King of Navarre, son of Thibaut, who died before the Fifth Crusade, undertook to discharge the vow his father had made to the Church and to Christ. The King of Navarre was celebrated among knights and among troubadours. His muse, which had sung profane loves, now gave voice to the complaints of Jerusalem, and awakened, by Christian songs, the ardor of the soldiers of the cross. "Learn," said he, "that heaven is closed to all those who will not cross the seas to visit and defend the tomb of God. Yes, all the brave, all who love God and glory, will not hesitate to take up the cross and arms. Those who prefer repose to honor, those who dread perils, will remain alone in their homes. Jesus Christ, in the day of judgment, will say to the one party, 'You, who helped me to bear my cross, go to the place in which dwell the angels and my mother Mary.' He will say to the others, 'You, who have not succored me, descend to the abode of the wicked.'" 243. The example and the exhortations of Thibaut attracted princes, barons, and knights from all the provinces of France. Pierre de Drac, Duke of Brittany, whom the clergy named Mauclerc, because, in his youth, he had abandoned the ecclesiastical state, wished to expiate his numerous felonies, his unjust wars, his tyranny towards his subjects, his perfidies towards his allies, by the holy pilgrimage. Hugh IV, Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Bar, Fez, Macon, Joigny, Sancourt, and Nevers. Simon de Montfort, Andrew de Vitry, Amaury Fils, Geoffrey d'Ancins, and a crowd of barons and knights took the cross, and engaged to follow the Duke of Brittany and the King of Navarre into Palestine. As the preaching of the crusade had been accompanied by several abuses that might prove injurious to the success 287 of the Holy Expedition, a council assembled at Tours, employed itself in remedying and stopping the evil at its source. We have seen, on preceding occasions, that preachers of the Crusades, by receiving criminals under the banners of the cross, had scandalized Christian knights. And crusades, as was seen in the 12th century, were not considered as a means of salvation for the faithful, and as the way of the Lord, in which all the world might enter. Great criminals no longer found a place in the ranks of the pious defenders of Christ. The Council of Tours decided that crusaders, arrested by justice, should be transferred to the hands of an ecclesiastical judge, who would pay no respect to their privileges, and should even take the cross from them, if he found them guilty of homicide or any other great crime committed against divine and human laws. As in other crusades, the people were led into violent excesses against the Jews, whom they accused of having immolated the God for whom they were going to fight, and who retained immense treasures in their hands, whilst the Crusaders were obliged to pledge their property to perform the voyage to Palestine. In order to stop the course of these popular violences, the council forbade any ill treatment of the Jews either by plundering them of their wealth or by doing them personal injury, under pain of heavy ecclesiastical censures. Another abuse, not less prejudicial to the Crusaders than all the others, had been likewise observed. The preachers of the Holy Wars and many other theologians had permitted Crusaders to buy off their vow by paying a sum of money equal to that which they would have expended in their pilgrimage, 244. This abuse caused great scandal among the faithful, but the Holy See, which derived considerable sums from it, paid no attention to the complaints made on account of that in England and many other states of Europe. The Crusaders were preparing for their departure, when, all at once, a fresh cry of alarm resounded through the west. The Empire of the Latins, at Constantinople, was reduced to the lowest extremity. After the reigns of Baldwin of Flanders and his son Henry, the family of Courtenay, 288, called to the throne, derived nothing from their exaltation but the griefs and reverses inseparable from the government of an empire which is hastening to decay. Peter of Courtenay, Count of Auxerre, when on his way to take possession of the throne of Baldwin, was surprised and massacred in Macedonia, by the orders of Theodore Comnenus, Prince of Epirus. A short time afterwards, the Empress, who had arrived at Constantinople by sea, died of grief, on learning the tragical end of her husband. Robert of Courtenay, second son of Peter, only ascended the throne to experience the rapid decline of the empire. Conquered in a great battle by Vataces, the successor of Lascaris, he lost all the provinces situated beyond the Bosphorus and the Hellespont. Whilst, on the other side, the Prince of Epirus took possession of Thessaly and a great part of Thrace. Constantinople, threatened by formidable enemies, beheld from its towers the standards of the Greeks of Nice and of the barbarians of Mount Haemus, floating near its walls and insulting its majesty. Amidst these various disasters, Robert died, leaving, as his only successor, his brother Baldwin, still in his childhood. John of Brienne, whom fortune had made, for a short period, King of Jerusalem, was called to the tottering throne of Constantinople, at the moment that the Greeks and Bulgarians, animated by the ardor of pillage, were at the gates of the capital. Their fleets penetrated to the port, their numerous battalions were preparing to scale the ramparts. But the new emperor fought several battles with them, obtained possession of their ships, and dispersed their armies. The miraculous victories of John of Brienne added greatly to his renown, but only served to diminish his forces. After having defeated his enemies, he found himself without an army. And whilst the poets were comparing him to Hector, Roland, and Judas Maccabeus, 245, he was obliged 289, to wait in his capital for succors that had been promised him, and which never arrived. More than 80 years of age, he terminated his active career in contesting with the barbarians the remains of a power which had been founded by arms, and the miserable wreck of which could only be preserved by prodigies of valor. The ruins which surrounded him in his last moments must have made him sensible of the nothingness of human grandeur, and produced sentiments of Christian humility. He had passed the early days of his life amidst the austerities of the cloister. On his deathbed he laid aside the imperial purple, and was desirous of breathing his last sigh in the habit of a cordelier. A simple French knight, seated for some few days upon two thrones, both ready to pass away, son-in-law of two kings, 246, father-in-law of two emperors, John of Brienne only left, when dying, the remembrance of his extraordinary exploits, and the example of a wonderful destiny. Young Baldwin, who had married his daughter, and who was to have succeeded him, was unable to obtain his inheritance. And departing as a fugitive from his capital, he wandered through Europe as a suppliant, braving and enduring the contempt of princes and nations. Spectacle worthy of pity. The successor of the Caesars, clothed in the purple, was beheld imploring the charity of the faithful, begging for the assistance granted to the lowest indigents, and frequently not obtaining that for which he sued. Whilst the Emperor of the East was thus traveling through Italy, France, and England, Constantinople was left without an army, and sacrificed for the defense of the state, even to its relics, the objects of the veneration.
I gotta face it, man. I am really tired. I didn't get in bed until 10 o'clock. Got up at 3. That's not enough sleep. So, I think I'm just gonna have to face the music and end the stream. Get back when I can. Keep praying for us, folks, because we got some bums, yeah, man, that don't do nothing. But I've seen, some little bit of effort or whatever on the horizon. So there's always hope that people will repent and believe. They need to get their ass in gear. Otherwise, it's going to get worse. All right, so until next time, it's not going to be next time. See you later.